Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today, we're going to make a display case for my Stetson. Now, I know that not everyone out there has a Stetson. Matter of fact, most soldiers don't even have this mildly unauthorized piece of headgear. But as an old cavalry officer, I've had mine for over 40 years. I recently built a hat rack, but that quickly filled up with hats we wear on a regular basis, and my Stetson gets dusty out in the open. But this case could be just as easily used for any heirloom or collectible you may have. And as a matter of fact, the idea for it came from an old cavalry friend of mine who had a case like this on legs in his living room. And between my jacked up hand and the design I have in mind, I think we'll have a few interesting challenges to deal with. Whatever it is you want to put on display, see if we can make a case to put them in. Most of my projects start with a drawing. Sometimes they're very detailed, and other times they just give me some basic measurements. The key measurements I have here are the space needed to fit the hat in place and leave about an inch on all sides. Since what's in the case is more important than the case itself, I'm making the structure as small as possible. The plan is to use 3/4 inch square stock for the support pieces that will hold the clear sides. I had some 1 inch by 3/4 inch strips left over from another job, so I just needed to mill them square. Once the dimensions were close, I took one light pass on 2 perpendicular sides, made another small adjustment, and then ran the other 2 sides. This removed the last of the finish that was on the pieces, and left them square and just a hair under 3/4 inch. I set a stop on my miter saw and cut the pieces to length, starting with the 4 long rails. I reset the stop and cut the 4 short rails. One last adjustment, and I cut the 4 uprights. Since my right hand is still a little weak, these cuts were a bit awkward. Back at the table saw, I set up a 1/4 inch dado set to cut a groove in each piece. The plan is to use 1/8 inch plexi for the sides, and I thought that would be too small for the joinery. So I'll cut all the grooves at 1/4 inch and add filler strips later to hold the glass in place. Since most of the parts will have a groove on 2 sides, I decided not to center the grooves. In larger pieces, this wouldn't be an issue, but with the stock this narrow, centered grooves would weaken the structure. This should make more sense as I make the second groove on the uprights. My hand got tired, so I called it a day. Luckily, I had kept the saw set up because I forgot to cut the second grooves for the upper rails. With all the glass grooves cut, it was time to work on the tenons. The blade stayed at the same height that I used for the grooves, and I grabbed my tenoning jig that rides on the saw fence. After a few test cuts, I could cut the first half of the tenons. If you look closely, you'll see pencil marks on the face that I'm working on. These marks remind me what face to cut and which not to. Each piece is cut, and then flipped end for end, and the second pass is made. Since the grooves are not centered, the tenons aren't either. I could have added a thicker dado stack to cut the second wider shoulder, but changing blades with this hand is uncomfortable, so I cleaned them up in 3 passes. The first was the same setup as the other side, then I adjusted the fence and made the second pass. One more adjustment and a few test cuts, and I made the final pass on all the pieces. A few joints are just a bit looser than I had hoped, but I think we can fix that. This is my worst one. I'm pretty sure it had more to do with the lack of strength and control in my hand than my setup. The important thing to correct is the tightness of the tenon. To do that, I'll cut a piece of maple edge banding to size. I've been using adhesive back banding for a while, and this maple piece should do the trick. Once it's in place, I add a little clamping pressure to bond them together. The excess is trimmed off with a razor knife, and if all goes well, I'll have a snug tenon. The second loose joint at least had square shoulders to work with, and a slightly smaller gap. The process is the same, and this should be nearly invisible once the joint is glued together. With the cuts I've made so far, the sides are ready to accept the plexiglass panels, but the top panel won't slide into the rails, so we'll have to make a notch to accept that. I've set up my mortising attachment in the drill press. With a 1/4-inch mortising bit installed, the fence set, and a stop block in place, these should clean up quickly. My stop block was off just a bit, so I added some card spacers. There's also a rear spacer since my slot will be just over 1/4 of an inch in from the front edge. The first pass cleans out most of the notch, then that back spacer is removed and the second pass finishes the notch. This removes most of the waste in the notch, leaving just a bit to be cleaned up by hand. I use a 1/4-inch chisel to square the corners and then clean out the waste with an 1/8-inch chisel. Just work carefully since there isn't much holding that last bit of material in place. I know because I cracked the first one. I glued that back in place and carried on cleaning out the other notches, being a bit more careful. With the joinery complete, I can dry assemble the pieces and measure for the plexi. After squaring up the frame, I used 2 storage sticks to find the length. Each is set in place and pushed out so they are tight against the grooves. Then I can mark the end of one stick where the other stick ends. Take them out, line up the end to the tick mark, and then measure from end to end. The first measurement I got was 16.5 inches, but I'll cut my panels a 1/16 of an inch shorter to give me some wiggle room. And I repeat that process for the other side as well. The height of the panel could be determined the same way, but since they're so short, I used a different technique. One side is assembled and squared, and then I mark the inside of the groove where the rails meet the stiles. The frame is disassembled, and I can measure the distance between the 2 lines. Rather than try to get the hook of my tape in the groove, I start my measurement at 10 inches and then read across to the other line, giving me a height of 7 inches, which again I'll drop a 1/16 for clearance. I'm using 1/8-inch plexiglass for this box. I can cut it in my shop, and I don't have to worry about glass breaking and having to replace it, which would be nearly impossible with the design I've chosen. To cut the panels, I'm using my plywood blade and the table saw. I've heard that some people like to install their blades backwards when cutting plastics, but I've never had a problem cutting this way, so just go slow. You can't tell in these shots, but I always wear safety glasses and hearing protection, and I highly recommend a respirator for these cuts. Cutting plastic stinks. The bits that come off the saw are hot and sharp, and they go everywhere. Just be warned. With the top and sides of the panel cut, it's time for a dry fit. This is clear plexi. I'm just leaving the protective sheets on as long as possible. If you'll notice, I've left out the rear top rail. That rear panel will be the access point, allowing me to get to the Stetson, so it needs one last cut so it can be slid in and out. This inner corner is in the way, so it's back to the table saw to remove that. I want to sneak up on the cut to leave me with a clean shoulder that lines up with the inside of the upper groove. Once I'm happy with the fence location, I make a full pass. And if all goes well, the rail will just slide into place. While the unit was still dry assembled, I marked each panel for the depth of each groove. I trimmed off the excess cover sheet from both faces with a straight edge and a sharp razor. It's time to put this thing together, or at least the first part of the assembly. This took a bit of juggling, but I started by gluing legs to either side of a long rail with wood glue and clamped that together. I made sure the ends of the legs were aligned with the outer edge of the rails before repeating that for the other side as well. Before inserting the plexi into the frame, I added a bead of E6000 adhesive. This is cool stuff as it will adhere to most anything. Now I can add glue to the tenons of the front piece, add some E6000 to the groove, and clamp the unit together. The rear rail gets no glue or E6000, it's just there as a spacer for now. I check to make sure the legs and rails are aligned, and then check the panel for square. After dropping in the side panels to help keep the legs square, it's time to add the world's smallest spacers. These guys are an 1/8 of an inch thick, 1/4 of an inch wide and cut to the length of each side. A drum sander would have made my life much easier while I milled these, but I sold mine years ago. I milled them to be a tight fit between the maple and the plexi, and I drove them home with a hammer and a wooden block. There's enough pressure to hold them there, but I also made sure to get a bit of the E6000 on those as well. I let that dry overnight, and then it was time to add the side panels. More E6000 in the grooves, and a little glue on the tenons. I dropped the panel in the grooves, set the lower rail in place, and after ensuring that the rail was even with the legs, I added a clamp. The last step was to tap the spacers in place, before repeating all of that on the other side and front. The only adhesive for the back panel went on the lower rail tenons. The panel was set in place but not glued, since this will have to slide in and out later. One more clamp, and the piece was set aside to dry. And if I haven't mentioned this, while wood glue dries in an hour or so, E6000 can take upwards of 72 hours to fully cure. The next day I came back to secure the upper rear rail to the rear panel. Another bead of E6000 in that groove, and the rail was set in place. Once the filler strips were added, the unit was set aside to dry overnight. The next day I added a final bead of E6000, this time to a strip that I milled to look just like the other frame parts, and clamped that to the upper plexi panel, and it was time for one more night of drying. To make my life a bit easier, I pre-finished the interior. Once the bottom is in place, this would be nearly impossible to finish. While that was drying, it was time to move on to a sort of stand for the hat. I had some poplar that was about 1.25 inches thick and used some double-stick tape to hold it to some sacrificial plywood. I used an 1/8 inch bit to drill the pilot hole for my circle cutting jig. I didn't need to go more than 1/2 inch deep for the centering pin, although I mistakenly drilled a through hole. I connected my palm router to the circle jig, added a 1/4 inch spiral bit, and set the pin to give me a 3¼ inch radius. Since I want the circle to be 6½ inches in diameter, the measurement is from the center of the pin to the near side of the router bit. I set the bit depth to 1/8 inch, set the pin in place, started the router, and then lowered the router into the cut. After each full rotation, I lowered the bit about another 1/8 inch and repeated the process until I had cut all the way through the blank. A second circle was cut from 1/2 inch stock, but this time the diameter was 8 inches. Swapping over to my table router and a 1/4 inch roundover bit, I eased one face on both discs. The first pass removed the majority of the waste, then I adjusted the bit height and made the second light pass, giving me a nice roundover on both pieces. A little bit of sanding took care of any remaining machining marks. With a 3/8 inch brad point bit in my drill press, I drilled a new alignment hole in both pieces. Again, it would have saved some work if I hadn't drilled a through hole in the thick disc, but I'll fix that with a bit of filler later. The thin disc, however, does need a through hole. To connect the two discs, I added glue on the underside of the smaller disc, set a 3/8 inch dowel into the hole, and then set them onto the thinner disc. A few clamps hold things in place while the glue dries. I made sure to set the top of the dowel flush to the top of the disc. This left about 1/2 inch of dowel protruding from the bottom, and I'll use that to align them to the bottom panel later. I swapped out the roundover bit for a rabbet bit and set my height for about 1/8 inch. I'll use this to cut the rabbet in the bottom of the display case. I made 3 passes until the depth of my rabbet was 1/4 inch. Several light passes are always safer and cleaner than a few heavy passes. I think it's easier to square my corners rather than round the piece that will fit in here, so I used a couple of sharp chisels to clean up the curves left by the router bit. With the rabbet set and the corners square, I could cut the base to size. I'm using 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood for this. And rather than measure, I set the panel in place and marked the edge of the rabbet. Then I could trim the bottom at the table saw. With the length just right, I repeated the same process for the width. With a snug fit, it was time for one more rabbet. This time the rabbet goes on the plywood bottom. Again, I used several passes until the plywood bottom sat flush with the outside of the case frame. Using a straight edge, I marked the center of the bottom panel by drawing diagonal lines from corner to corner. I put a stop collar on my 3/8 inch brad point bit to give me a 1/2 inch deep hole. Drilling from the inside, this will give me a place to align the two discs. Sadly, I tightened that stop collar with my wonky hand, and it slipped. Rather than a stopped hole, I got a through hole. Since this piece is for me and no one will ever see the bottom, I'll just leave it as it is. After taping off the rabbets and the center of the base, I gave it a few coats of spray varnish. The circles that'll hold the hat get a few coats of black spray paint to help blend it in when I put my Stetson on there. I removed all the tape, added some glue to the circles, and then pressed it in place. This would be difficult to clamp, so I gave the circles a few twists to spread the glue and give it a friction bond. Between that and the centering pin, this piece shouldn't move around. The case itself had been pre-finished as well. I'd switched over to spray lacquer, and I'm glad I did. As I removed the white cover sheets, I realized that the urethane that I had brushed on the inside had seeped beneath the cover sheets in several places. I was not a happy camper. If I had used glass, I could have just scraped off the finish with a razor blade. I didn't want to risk scratching the plexi, so I found that denatured alcohol and a few hours of elbow grease cleaned things up pretty well. The joinery for the rear panel had picked up some excess finish as well. A bit of sanding on the tenons and some chisel work on the grooves, and that rear panel drops into place. The last step of this build is to glue the bottom to the case itself. A bead of glue in the case rabbet, and the bottom was set in place. There are a few imperfections on the plywood bottom, and I'd planned to put those near the back of the case. To remind myself where that was, I marked the back with a bit of tape. A clamp in each corner holds the base in place until the glue dries. Nothing left to do now but to set my Stetson in place, drop in the rear panel, and find an appropriate place to display this part of my personal history. I'll admit this project was more challenging than I planned. Between the small joinery, the jacked up right hand, the slow setting adhesive, and the finish getting on the plexi, I had my share of headaches. To make matters worse, I've recently been able to start working with clients again, and that slowed this build down even more. Even still, I think the case came out great. The plan for this is to live in my new shop, which is getting closer to reality. I'd like to use it as part of my backdrop, and now that it's all closed in, my hat will stay clean. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. I'm sure there was something I could have done easier, smarter, maybe even safer. Drop them in the comments below. I'd also like to know if you'd like to build a piece like this to display some of your collectibles. As usual, I'll add some links to the tools and equipment I used in this build and some of the stuff I use here in the shop on a daily basis. Should you happen to need one of those items and buy it through those links, it does help keep the channel going. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. And if you haven't already, maybe it's time to hit that subscribe button and little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. This is one of those rare times where I think I know what's coming up next, because the holidays are fast approaching and I haven't even started on the gifts. So maybe we can squeeze in a quick gift idea before the holidays, or if you're like me, you can build it in January and send it to your friends and family then. Until then, guys, have a great day. Stay safe. We'll see you soon.